So, good evening, everybody. My name is Ronan Keane. I'm Chair of Engineers Ireland Cork region, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's lecture on offshore wind energy. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Keane Desmond of Gavin and Doherty GDG Solutions. Keane is a civil engineer with a master's in renewable energy technology and a PhD in wind energy, and has been working in EU-funded research projects for the last 10 years. Has recently joined GDG as Head of Innovation. He's currently leading development of a task for the International Energy Agency, which focuses on maximising social, economic and environmental benefit of floating wind arrays. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Keane.
Great. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Ronan, maybe give me a thumbs up there. Yep. Great,
perfect.
Great stuff. Happy days. Yeah, so listen, just first off, thanks very much to Ronan and to Engineers Ireland for the invitation to come along and speak with you this evening. Great to see such a strong turnout. Just before I get started, just to mention it's bedtime here in the Desmond household. So if you hear some screams in the background, just to explain what's going on there. So I'm actually going to stop sharing my video here just to save in the bandwidth so we can focus in on the presentation itself. So there we go. Okay, so tonight's lecture presentation is all about offshore wind in Ireland and looking at the challenges and the opportunities which it presents. Okay, so just to give an idea of the scale of development that we're talking about here when we talk about offshore wind in Ireland, the graph that I'm showing here is from an excellent report which was produced by EirGrid back in October of 2019. Tomorrow's Energy Scenarios 2019 Ireland, Planning Our Energy Future. It's actually a revision of this due out imminently. I think it's in the first quarter of 2020. There's going to be an updated version of this released. And it's really excellent report. They look at all the sources of energy and sources of consumption that we have on the Irish grid and then plan out for future scenarios. So they have kind of a low, medium and a high renewable energy rollout scenarios. So what I've done in this graph here is to extract the values for the coordinated action scenario, so the high level of offshore wind development in Ireland that EirGrid were envisaging when they produced a report back in October of 2019. So you can see there we're expecting quite an aggressive rollout from what have we got currently with 25 megawatts in Arklow Bank, ramping up to just below a gigawatt by 2025, getting up to 3.5 gigawatt by 2030, and then ultimately surpassing 6 gigawatt by 2040. Just to look at the 3.5 gigawatt by 2030, just to give us a feel for what that actually means. That would be a total capex in the region of 10 billion euros. These are estimates, they'll vary widely, but just as a kind of a starting point, at least, we'd be talking about a capex of 10 billion euros to achieve 3.5 gigawatt. That's not including the operation and maintenance of the wind farms and ultimately the decommissioning. This is just up to the installation of the 3.5 gigawatts. That's the equivalent to 7 children's hospitals or about 50 Ardna crushes if you adjust for inflation. So these are massive infrastructure projects and it's a real massive opportunity for us here in Ireland. Of course, it's going to be slightly different. The capital used to develop offshore wind is going to be a mixture of public and private capital, whereas Ardna Crusha and the Children's Hospital was a purely public endeavour. But also, what we're seeing is this target has actually been revised up. So it was a 3.5 gigawatt previously, but the government in the programme for government have upped this to a target of 5 gigawatts by 2030. So this presentation is all about looking at that, looking at what's actually achievable, and just stepping through the challenges and the opportunities which this transition presents. Before I can get stuck into that, I'm mandated to give an introduction to GDG, Gavin and Doherty GDG Solutions. So Gavin and Doherty GDG Solutions was founded in 2011. It's a specialist geotechnical and environmental engineering consultancy with a strong background in geomechanics, applied geotechnical research, environmental management and renewables. And the company provides innovative solutions across a broad range of sectors. We currently have offices here in Cork, Dublin, Belfast, also London, Edinburgh and Bath. We're currently employing about 80 geologists, geotechnical engineers, structural engineers, and environmental scientists. The range of services that we offer are covered by 6 broad service sectors: offshore marine, urban development, infrastructure, environmental, innovation, and temporary works. So obviously tonight is kind of most focused on this area of offshore and marine. So let's dig into that in a little bit more detail. We have experience of working on over 35 offshore wind projects across 10 different countries and have been involved in all key project stages from consenting right through to end-of-life decision-making processes. And the range of services that we offer in these 35 projects include survey management, marine advisory services, ground modelling, structural design, port planning, and also the design of key infrastructure. In terms of innovation, so as Ronan said, my role in GDG is head of innovation. So that idea of an engineering consultancy having an innovation department, indeed a head of innovation, may be alien to some people on the call. So just to give an idea of what's involved in innovation and what the role entails in GDG. So really, I am working across the GDG portfolio to ensure that we have the knowledge, connections, and expertise to meet the future needs of our customers. Currently, we have about 20 active R&D projects, giving us a total R&D budget for GDG of about 1.7 million. From this, we have 9 PhD students currently, and also 3 senior researchers. We draw down research funding from a range of both national and international organisations. Nationally, we're looking at Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, the Irish Research Council, the Marine Institute, EPA, GSI, and Enterprise Ireland. On an international basis, we are dealing with the International Energy Agency, talking a little bit more about that later on. Also Innovate UK and the European Commission through the Horizon 2020 programme and the upcoming programmes. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, we can get on with the topic of this evening's lecture. So we can return to the vast ocean of opportunity presented by the development of offshore wind in Ireland. So if anyone's read a press release, you know that we've got a sea area 10 times our land area. We've also got the strongest winds in Europe. So it seems like a very rosy picture, but we need to counterbalance that looking at the challenges that are presented by the development of these technologies. So what I'm going to use as a kind of framework for talking through these opportunities and challenges is a piece of work that I actually did with my previous employer. So I moved to GDG in October of last year. And before that, I was working for 6 years in the Marai Centre here in Cork also, which is the Science Foundation funded research centre for marine energy and climate research. And one of the projects that I'm involved in was Airwind, where we're looking at co-designing opportunities towards the development of Irish offshore wind. And part of that work, myself and my colleague Felix Butchlek went through kind of a series of interviews where we discussed the future of offshore wind in Ireland. So these were a series of 2-hour interviews, which were conducted between the 1st of May and the 8th of June 2020. We had 9 interviewees from industry. These were the Airwind Consortium partners, who included SSE Renewables, Simply Blue, EDPR, Equinor, DP Energy, Statkraft, ESB, and Brookfield. And we're extremely lucky. We got a very high senior management level involvement in these interviews. So we were absolutely honoured that they gave us 2 hours of their time to sit down and talk through this. We also had 6 policy interviewees. So these were primarily senior civil servants in the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment, and also the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, and also a representative from the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. So this is a really interesting period, and I guess the reason that these people could give us 2 hours of their time was it was actually during the first lockdown that we had during the COVID crisis. So we had all that uncertainty about working from home and wearing masks and washing hands and all that new world that we were entering into back in May. But it was also the time of the government formation talks, and also Brexit was looming large at the time, and there was a lot of uncertainty about what Brexit meant for us. So it was a very interesting time. I think this report gives a nice snapshot of the state of the nascent offshore wind energy industry in Ireland. So there's a total of 30 hours of interviews that we conducted. So really tonight I can only give a snapshot of what was discussed. So I'd strongly encourage you, if you're interested, I've included links to this deliverable, deliverable 6.6, which gave an overview of the interviews. And there's also a link there to all the Airwind public deliverables. There's about 20 in all. Some really excellent stuff came out of that project, and it's all, well, most of it is open access. So if you follow that link, you'll be able to read up on the project and everything that was achieved. So with these interviews for the 15 participants, the first thing that we did was to look at the expected level of development of offshore wind. So what we did is we stepped through the EirGrid Tomorrow Energy Scenarios 2019 Ireland document, which, as I said, came out in October 2019. And this had the original government target of 3.5 gigawatt by 2030. And obviously since then, that's been updated following the government formation talks to a new target of 5 gigawatts. So just to show you where the interviewees thought was actually achievable by 2030. Firstly, looking at industry, you can see the industry interviewees had quite a broad spread from quite pessimistic 1 gigawatt of development by 2030, right up to a very optimistic of 5 gigawatt, which is bang on the government target. But an average value for industry developed by 2030 of 2.8 gigawatts. For the policymakers, perhaps unsurprisingly, there's kind of convergence around the government target of 3.5 gigawatt, with two outliers who were a bit more pessimistic, down at 1.5 and 2 gigawatts would be achieved by 2030. Just look at some of the logic or the reasons underpinning these values. The pessimistic industry interviewee said we're starting at a very low level. Once the supply chain and the development processes are developed, there will be more of an exponential growth, with most installations happening past 2035. So quite a pessimistic view of the development potential up to 2030. At the more optimistic level, they pointed to the difficulty developing onshore wind energy. So 8 gigawatt onshore development seems implausible, and it requires a leap in multiples of installed capacity against a backdrop of new tightening onshore planning regulations. If decarbonisation is a primary motivation, we need to move fast. If you move fast, it is reasonable to suggest that you won't capture the full supply chain opportunities. So just showing that if we move very quickly on this, it's going to be difficult for the supply chain to catch up. Kind of more on government target, even this was seen as optimistic. This value is very optimistic, more of a target really. If we have a centralized approach, progress will be slow, perhaps 1 gigawatt by 2030. A decentralized approach will take us to the 3.5 gigawatt target. I'll have a little bit more about the centralized and decentralized approaches a bit later on in the presentation. In terms of the policymakers, we can't repeat the mistakes onshore. An 18-month delay now may prevent a 5-year delay later. A good start is half the battle. So encouraging kind of a reserved approach to development in order that we can get it right from the outset. And those that were on the government target were saying, whilst the industry interviews are saying it was more of a target that they didn't think was really achievable, there was more positivity really from the policymakers, saying there was an informed optimism based on knowledge of the determination within the 3 principal policy divisions that are driving this forward: marine spatial planning, legislation, and energy policy, to achieve success. And also, I'm quite confident that the East Coast projects will deliver 3.5 gigawatt by 2030. There's not blind optimism. I believe we can get there. And then also pointing to the potential need for floating wind above 3.5 gigawatt, we'd need to move to the south or west coast with floating, and there is uncertainty whether that is technically achievable. Again, we'll have a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. So I guess that gives a nice kind of snapshot of the ambition in industry and in policymakers. I was kind of centered around this original 3.5 gigawatt target that the government had set out. So the next step in the interviews was to look at the options for defining development zones. So in the lead up to this work, we looked at the international best practice on how you select these development zones for offshore wind energy. And what we presented during the interviews was what happened in the UK with these two broad options, option 1 and option 2. Option 1 is the central definition of single sites. So this was used in the UK round 1 and round 2 offering, which ran from 2001 to 2010. And the average size of the sites here was about 100 to 500 megawatts. So it's really in the early days of the UK offshore wind energy industry. It's also been used in Belgium from the year 2000 up to present. The average size of the sites there varies between 200 and 500 megawatts of offshore wind energy. And it's been a real success story in Belgium, actually. They've got a ridiculously tight area of seabed available to them, but they've managed to develop a total of 2.2 gigawatts of wind energy using this central definition of single sites approach. Option 2, this is where you have decentralized definition of individual sites within predefined areas. So this is the approach that has been used in the UK round 4 offering, and a similar approach has been used in Scotland, where the government identify these large areas of seabed where they're willing to entertain suggestions to develop offshore wind farms. So what they did here in the UK round 4 is they went through an 18-month process of engaging with all the key stakeholders and essentially achieving this kind of partial social license to operate within these 4 large zones. And then it's up to the developers to carve up these areas of seabed and then to pursue a full social license to operate in order to get these sites developed. I should mention those red rectangles are completely indicative and not related to anything in the real world, just to give you the idea that these sites are carved up by the developers themselves. So this round 4 approach is going to be used in England and Wales, and also in Scotland for the rollout of offshore wind between 2020 and 2030. And in England and Wales, they're looking to achieve a total of between 7 and 8.5 gigawatts developed using these methods. So we defined these methods to the interviewees and talked through the different options and the strengths and weaknesses of them, and then asked them to kind of essentially cast their vote and see which of these options they think would be most suitable in the Irish context. So with the industry, just to mention throughout this presentation, industry is in blue, policymakers are in green. So for the industry representatives, you can see that it's heavily weighted towards this decentralized definition of sites within defined areas. So 5 votes versus 2 and 2 sitting on the fence. So advantages of option 1 are a much easier stakeholder engagement process and better grid integration. So this idea, if it's centrally defined, the government can do the heavy lifting in terms of the stakeholder engagement and also the securing of grid integration options. And then those that voted for option 2, one of them said option 1 is resource intensive, and the Irish government may not have the finances or resources to do this. Perhaps this is even more pertinent now given the rounds of lockdowns that we've gone through since these interviews took place. In terms of the policymakers, there was a complete spread, 2 for option 1, 2 for option 2, and 2 sitting on the fence. One of the interviewees that went for option 1 said, my recommendation would be to collect more resource information as well as ecological information to work with an option 1 model. So that completely jars with what the industry representative was saying, that it's resource intensive. The government aren't wind farm developers. They need to get out of the way and let the developers get on with it. And then the policymaker that was leaning towards the decentralized version, I'm not sure if option 1 will ever become viable. We're too data and time limited for that to be achievable. And also we need to get away from the buccaneering mindset and achieve a plan-led approach with complete transparency in the process and the expectations in order to give developers more certainty. So this cry for certainty so that we know what is achievable and when it's achievable by that kind of carried through all of the interviews, be they with industry or policymakers. So once we talked about the level of expected development and the different methodologies for defining offshore wind development zones, the next step was to look at the actual development constraints. So before I start out, just to say this is purely conceptual. The data that we use is sound, but it needs to be interpreted with a range of stakeholders and done so carefully. So as I said, this was a 18-month process in the UK to define the round 4 sites. So we certainly weren't trying to recreate that with a series of 2-hour interviews conducted over Zoom. But look, I find it's very interesting, the output of these interviews, and I hope you'll find it of interest also. So what we started off with was a base map. So what we were doing here is indicating the main population centers in the country in orange. And you can see we got the boundaries here on the east coast, which is our exclusive economic zone. And then on the west coast, we have the 200-meter isobath. So we're only considering areas of the seabed where the water depth was less than 200 meters during these interviews. And the reason that we included the population centres is that the grid infrastructure that we have in Ireland is well aligned with the distribution of population around the country, with the exception of the generation capacity here in Moneypoint, of course. And also just to give a feel for the likely visual impact and the areas that might be concerned about viewing the development of offshore wind farms. So the first constraint that we introduced was aquaculture. So you can see them popping up there on the screen. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer here. You can see there kind of these kind of blue-green areas near the coast. So these are coastal communities who have licensed activities for the production of fish and shellfish. So the interviewees noted that the cabling distance to shore and landfall are huge considerations for project viability. So why we wouldn't be expecting to see offshore wind being developed in these very close to coast zones, it is important that we have this information on aquaculture on the maps for consideration, given the need to consider landfall of electrical cables. So 69% of interviewees, both industry and policy, wish to keep this aquaculture layer turned on. Next, we looked at the special areas of conservation. So these areas are defined under the Habitats Directive, and they don't actually preclude development. But if you wish to develop in a special area of conservation, there's an extra level of environmental impact assessment which is required. So commentary from interviewees from industry. Our initial experience from onshore wind was that getting planning permission in/near special areas of conservation was possible, but that has become increasingly difficult. So now we include these as a constraint in our scoping for new sites. So once bitten, twice shy there perhaps. They're no longer considering SACs when they're scoping for sites. And from the policy side, with SACs, it depends on what they are designated for. The question should be asked as to whether or not co-location is possible. So it was interesting that the idea of co-location with special areas of conservation, the government are open to that idea. So 88% of interviewees opted to keep the special area of conservation layer on. And just to mention here as well, currently we've got about 2.5% of our seabed is designated as marine protected areas. And there's a target of getting to 30% by 2030. So these green areas could potentially be getting significantly larger, which brings in this greater competition for use of the seabed. So we'll have to look at this potential for co-location even closer. So that MPA document is going out for consultation in 2021. So it'll be interesting to monitor how that progresses. EPA dumping grounds. So these are existing licensed activities for the dumping of dredge material from ports and quays out in the ocean. So you can see where they're located there near Dublin and Cork ports, and this large one down to the outside our exclusive economic area, in fact. Okay, so from policy, they're saying this is more of a project level decision. Dispersion of sediment is the main concern here. So there's, it's essentially dredge material waste that's being dumped out there. So if you're going placing a monopile through that, you need to look at the dispersion of sediment. And then from industry, wouldn't completely rule out EPA dumping grounds for all development. So again, the potential for co-location and co-use of space was identified here as an opportunity. But 70%, 69% of interviewees opted to keep the EPA dumping grounds on as a constraint when we're looking at the development of offshore wind. Oil and gas infrastructure. So firstly, what we did is we introduced the oil and gas lines and the interconnectors and put a 500-meter buffer on these. We've also done the south here. We've got the the Kinsale Head gas fields and the Corrib gas field up here in the west. So a policy interviewee saying old oil and gas sites would be potential sites into the future, but not before 2030. So that was left on by 94% of interviewees, these oil and gas pipelines, and also the areas of licensed activity. Okay, in terms of fishing activity, so this was the most contentious area that we spoke about. What we did is we collected AIS data, so that's automatic identification system data, for shipping vessels, for fishing vessels for just 12 months. So we took AIS data for the entire of the Airwind study area and just extracted fishing vessels for the past 12 months. Now what we did is we identified the top 10 and top 20 busiest areas for fishing activities within the Airwind study area. So this dark blue area is the top 20% most fished areas, and the light blue area overlaid on top of that is the top 10% busiest fishing areas that we had over that 12-month period. So as I said, fishing was really the area that created the largest amount of debate and discussion. So I'd encourage you to go take a look at the document if you're interested. But just again to give a snapshot from industry, fishing is not a simple on-off. Pop-based fishing will be fine. Trawling will be a problem. There needs to be a project-level, case-by-case assessment based on community engagement and the type of fishing activity. From the policymakers, use of such maps should be encouraged, but they must be used in the right way and include relevant representation of activity. What narrative do maps provide? What stories do they allow you to tell? For example, in the maps shown here, there's a difficulty in relation to a lack of data for small-scale fishing. The communities have a far greater connection to these smaller vessels. So AIS, I think the cutoff is a 12-meter ship size. So we're losing the detail on the small-scale fishing here. And as the interviewee pointed out, these are the people that are going to be have a closer tie to the coastal communities. So the 20% fishing activity, so this is the dark blue, was left on by 67% of interviewees. Just to mention here, fishing activity changes season to season, year to year, and with the recent negotiations and the outcome of the negotiations and the Brexit discussions, it's going to be all change. So really, what this map is going to look like 12 months down the line, we don't have a clue. Everything's going to change quite dramatically. And then also when you consider the requirement for the designation of marine protected areas of 30% of the seabed, again, this kind of competition for the use of our marine space. Shipping. So first of all, the traffic separation schemes. So if you're unfamiliar with them, these are essentially lanes on the highway for shipping for vessels. And the TSS schemes, we have a large one here off the coast of Wexford, another one down here off the coast of Kerry. They're defined by the IMO and policed by the Coast Guard. So one of my ex-colleagues actually is an ex-ships captain, and he informed me that if you manage to stray outside of these TSSs, you very quickly get a very angry phone call from the Coast Guard. So they're very well adhered to. So 100% of interviewees asked to keep these TSSs on. Then we also had shipping lanes, so you can see them popping up here on the screen. So these are defined on Admiralty charts. What you see is that there's kind of less observance of these as the vessels get within 10, 15, 20 kilometers of the shore. They really get onto these shipping lanes, but further out to sea, they're kind of seen more as a kind of a guidance. So whereas the TSS are, very hard and fast rule, you have to be on these. For the shipping lanes, it's more of a guidance. But again, 65% of interviewees opt to keep these on. We then had vessel density. So what my colleagues, Felix and Jared Peters, did is they looked at the AIS data for tankers and cargoes in the last 12 months around Ireland, and they extracted the top 1.5 busiest areas within the Airwind study zone. So you can see the lot of activity here on the East Coast, also coming out of Cork. And this was chosen to be left on by 67% of the interviewees. Just some comments on that. It's important to differentiate between vessels that have no Irish contact, those that start or stop in Ireland, and those that start and stop in Ireland. The economic value to Ireland and the relationship the different routes have with coastal communities varies substantially for these three groups. So really the only way to get that level of detail is rigorous stakeholder engagement on the ground. And again, Brexit. So it's going to change us utterly. Who knows what this landscape is going to look like in 12 months down the line. So it's a real movable feast that we're looking at here in terms of the current and existing users of our marine space. So on this map here, what I've done is turned on all the different layers that the overwhelming majority of interviewees opted to have turned on. So just to refresh your memory, the dark blue is fishing, the yellow is traffic separation schemes, the green is the special areas of conservation, and the EPA dumping grounds in red. So you can see it's quite a busy area of sea that we have around Ireland. But big caveat with this, all data needs to be interpreted individually with the relevant stakeholders. As I said, this was an 18-month process in the UK. What I'm presenting here is purely just for guidance only, just to involve, just for the sake of discussion, in order to give us an idea of the constraints that are involved and the need for rigorous marine spatial planning. So the next layer that we looked at was more the technical constraints. So I guess these are kind of social economic constraints, but looking at the sheer technical constraints. The first one that we looked at is accessibility of the sites. So if anyone uses LinkedIn, I'm sure your LinkedIn feed is full of these beautiful pictures of wind turbines being installed, both fixed and floating wind turbines. But what always catches me when I look at these is it essentially looks like they're being installed on glass. You see very few white tops on the ocean when you're looking at these installation and decommissioning and operation maintenance pictures. And the reason for that is that if you've got an energetic, why is that popping up? Okay, if you've got an energetic sea state, it has an impact on your installation, operation, and decommissioning activities. Essentially, harsh conditions increase standby for vessels, and if you've got vessels that are standing by waiting to do their installation, decommissioning, operation, and maintenance activities, this has a knock-on effect on the cost. So it's difficult to know what the kind of accessibility threshold is and what level of accessibility we need in order for a project to be financially viable. But looking to the UK, both the UK Round 4 and the ScotWind projects, what they have looked at is they've set this kind of bound where you have to have a significant wave height of 2.5 meters or less 80% of the time. So they don't consider any sites where the significant wave height does not meet that criteria on an annual basis. So if you apply that constraint in Ireland, it really knocks off a substantial amount of our potential development area. I guess we all know that Ireland has got a lot of waves, and like this is what it boils down to. If we apply that UK Round 4 and ScotWind approach, it blacks off a significant amount of area on our seabed. Just some commentary on that. Industry interviewee said it would be prudent to stick with what the UK has gone with for the West Coast. I'm very surprised with the level of constraint imposed by 2.5 meter wave height. This is the main take-home message for me from this interview. And to be honest, a lot of interviewees said that there was, at least the people I talked to, it seemed that this area of accessibility and the extreme nature of the wave climate hadn't been given a lot of consideration. From the policymakers, maybe a stark warning here. Predictions suggest that climate change will result in large waves becoming larger still and occurring more frequently. It is important that we address this wave issue in the design phase. So pointing to potentially the increasing importance of the consideration of the wave climate at the sites that we're looking to develop. So 60% of interviewees opted to keep this 2.5 meter HS constraint as was used in the UK. Next up, we had water depth. So you can see there, if I flip between the two, there's this gray area that's overlaid on top of the red, which is popping up. So what that is the 60 meter contour. So the gray area is excluding water depths of 60 meters or deeper. So what we did is we presented 60 meter, 100 meter and 200 meter options to the interviewees. And we also told them that of the approximately 9,500 offshore wind turbines that have been installed globally to date, 0.1% of these are in waters deeper than 60 meters. So some feedback on that from experienced industry interviewee. Standard industry position, foundations deeper than that are not feasible. As a matter of fact, we would go with 50 meters. The off-the-shelf bathymetry is not that accurate, so the 10 additional meters also serve as a buffer for the data. And from a policymaker, the sites need to be economically viable. What can we afford post-COVID? If we are forced deeper, this will be more expensive and a subsidy will be required. So the outcome of that is 73% of interviewees opted to keep the 60 meter constraint activated. So as you can see, there's quite a narrow band left when we have these technical and social economic constraints and environmental constraints layered on. We're left with really quite a thin band down the south coast, up the east coast, with some pockets on the west coast, particularly in the northwest. So one of the industry interviewees said this is a good exercise. It certainly shows very clearly that the space is actually quite limited once all the other users, protected areas and technical constraints have been plotted on. That's I thought a very good point, so I'll put it on the presentation here. But as well as the existing users, you got to look at future users. So existing and future users of the marine space and coming up a way that we can have coexistence with them. And again, caveat, all data needs to be interpreted with relevant stakeholders. This is an 18-month process in the UK, so this really needs to be looked at just for guidance only as a kind of a starting point in this process, perhaps. But just zoom in there so we can get a kind of closer picture on these remaining viable sites along the east coast, the south coast, and some pockets up in the northwest. And then just to layer in there the size of a 500 megawatt wind farm. So I got this size. The rate they use is 5 megawatts per kilometer squared is typically the scale of seabed utilization that you get for a European offshore wind farm. There's a fantastic report on this, capacity densities of European offshore wind farms, which was released back in 2018. And they look at both the past, present and future trends. What's interesting is even as the size of your wind turbine increases, this utilization factor remains relatively constant. One exception actually is the guys in Belgium. They've really crammed in the wind turbines offshore there. I think they got up to 14 megawatts per kilometer squared, but that has a knock-on effect on the amount of energy that the turbines are producing because it increases the weight classes. Anyway, so that's the size of a 500 megawatt wind farm. So then if we're talking about the 3.5 gigawatt capacity that we're looking to get installed by 2030, you can see this is the amount of purple is getting very large for the amount of white area that we still have available. And if we look at the 5 gigawatt capacity, which is in the new program for government, even more so, if we add on 50% attrition rate, which is actually not very conservative. I've heard that on Ireland onshore, you can be looking at up to 80% attrition rate. And I know for the UK round 3 sites, they're operating at about 75% attrition rate. So if we allow for this, basically there's not enough space there without having these farms completely on top of each other and quite close to shore. So just some take homes from this, from my own experience in the interviews and the kind of message I'd like to pass on this evening is social acceptance will be absolutely key. We didn't talk about visual impact or the use of the sea area by existing and future users. And as one of the policymaker interviewees pointed out, this cannot be summarized with a data layer. It is crucial to be on the ground and speak to communities and engage stakeholders, ideally with concrete project ideas and proposals. From the industry point of view, we cannot take the same developer-led approach as onshore, which would take too long and cause a backlash with local communities and other stakeholders. And another comment from a policymaker, there's a need for a commitment to open, early engagement with stakeholders through a process in which participants are able to tangibly influence outcomes. So I think this is a real key point, and I think it's maybe one for us as engineers to internalize, that I guess we're always looking for the kind of most elegant solution, the solution that minimizes costs. But I guess the important point is that just because it's the best technically feasible option doesn't mean it's the best option. We need to engage. It's a multidisciplinary challenge. We need to look at the social, economic, environmental impacts of the design work that we're completing in order to achieve sustainability of the industry. And I guess this kind of resonates with the words that Michael D. Higgins said at his presentation to Engineers Ireland last year. He put it a lot more eloquently than I did, but he was really calling for this need for multidisciplinary education for engineers in the university sector. But really, I'd argue that it's too late. The challenge of climate change is happening this decade. We can't wait for the next crop of engineers to come up. We need to start utilizing this multidisciplinary approach in the work that we're conducting today. Another key point that I took from this process was floating wind is going to be needed in order to meet our 2030 targets. But as one of the policy interviewees put it, the cost is not right yet. Let's just take a little closer look at that. There was an excellent report which came out, which was written by DNVGL. It came out just at the tail end of 2020. I've included a link here in the presentation where you can download the report. And what they're doing is looking at the future trends of costs, levelized cost of energy for both fixed and floating wind energy. And what really grabbed my attention here was they're expecting that floating wind energy is going to be at the current price for fixed bottom in or around 2027. So in the next 7 years, decade, we're going to be at a stage where bottom fixed is competitive with current, where floating is competitive with current bottom fixed prices. So I thought that was quite ambitious, quite interesting, quite noteworthy. And then that resonated with one of the comments during the interview process. From experience in the onshore wind sector, it takes 10 years to take a project from concept to installation. It is likely to be longer offshore. So if we're looking at maybe a 15-year development cycle for offshore wind, perhaps it's pessimistic. And if we're expecting floating wind to be competitive in 2027, really we need to start considering these floating wind sites today. We need to make sure that we've got the consenting regime, the grid connections, the early rounds of stakeholder engagement completed so that we're not facing a bottleneck in 2025, 2026. And I was really impressed with this rate of learning. So if you look at the learning rate, the cost reduction that they're expecting here for floating wind, I don't know what the right term for it is, but ambitious, inspiring, I don't know what term I'd use, but it was certainly noteworthy. And really achieving this learning rate, this cost reduction can't be taken for granted. We need to work hard to achieve this. And that has been and is the focus of the work that we're doing in Gavin and Doherty Geotechnical when we're looking at the development of floating wind expertise in-house. So we currently have 6 PhD students working in the area of floating wind. Shauna Crean, Navid, Raul, Satish, Omar, and Zore. So Shauna is working on seabed characterization, morphodynamics, and seabed mobility. So she's focusing both on fixed and floating wind energy and building up a clear picture of the structure of the seabed characteristics and how that's likely to develop with time. So this is really going to be used for the de-risking of both fixed and floating wind energy projects. Navid is looking at advanced modeling of floating wind energy platforms. So what he's doing is producing validation data and validating CFD models and smooth particle hydrodynamic models, which will be used for the design of floating wind turbines. So as they're extremely complicated systems, they're going to be in extremely complicated environments, met-ocean conditions. There's dynamic loading, cyclic loading happening there. So they're very complicated platforms to design, and we need to get the risks down to develop a clearer picture of what's happening with these platforms. So Navid is looking at the development of validation data, which can be used for these next generation design tools. Raoul is a naval architect. What he's doing is looking at the options to broaden the operational windows for floating wind-related marine activities. So this is looking at the actual timescales involved in installation, operation, maintenance, and decommissioning activities, how long each of these marine activities take, what type of sea sites they're actually occurring in, and how we can broaden out that weather window so that we can achieve economic deployment in these harsher marine environments. So really interesting work that Raoul's conducting. Zora is looking at the optimized design of port facilities. This is all about maximizing the supply chain opportunities. So we need to maximize the local indigenous supply chain opportunities in order to secure the social license to operate. It's all about, ensuring a return for the taxpayer and that the opportunities presented by the development of offshore wind in Ireland aren't being exported. Omar is looking at the economics of the co-location of floating wind energy and hydrogen generation / storage technologies. So hydrogen is a hot button term in both research and industry. People perhaps see it as a bit of a panacea or a silver bullet. Omar is looking into that in a bit more detail. Satish is looking at the dynamic modeling of soil structure interactions using coupled aero, hydro, servo, elasto models for floating wind. So as I said, these are highly dynamic systems with coupled controllers. And what Satish is doing is looking at introducing geotechnical design considerations when you're doing design of your floating wind turbine. So it's looking at the cyclic loading imposed by the anchor on the soil and looking at the dynamic effect of that cyclic loading throughout the lifetime of the floating wind turbine. And kind of, I guess, the largest project that we have, which is going through the final stages of approval, is work that we're conducting on behalf of the International Energy Agency for their wind program. So the project is called IDEA. So it's all about the integrated design of floating wind arrays. So GDG are leading the development of this task with NREL, the National Renewable Energy Research Laboratory in the USA, and also IFPEM, who are the French equivalent of NREL in France. We've got a total of 44 organizations from 17 different countries involved. It's one of the largest participations that there has been for an IEA wind task. And what we're focusing on is maximizing the social, economic, and environmental benefits of floating wind arrays. As part of this, we'll be conducting detailed design of about 5 floating wind farms. So what we're going to do is look at the international pipeline of floating wind projects, and we'll be conducting a detailed design of 5 representative sites. And the idea is to facilitate this multidisciplinary design of the wind farms. And then also as part of the work, we will be involved in the development of a framework for the risk assessment of cascading failures. So if you have got multiple unmanned floating wind turbines out at sea, there's this probability of cascading failures if one mooring line snaps and you have this cascading failure throughout your floating wind farm. So during the topical experts meeting where we convened, I think it was 80 experts from around the world to talk about floating wind energy, this potential for cascading failures and a framework to look at it was proposed as an important area for further research. Okay, so that's all for me. So yeah, I spoke for 45 minutes there uninterrupted, which is, given that I've got three kids in my house, is something that's somewhat unusual for me. So yeah, great. Thanks for your attention, guys. I hope there's still people on the call.
Absolutely, 284 of them, to be precise. Thank you very much, Cian. Excellent lecture, very, very informative.